Although it's a little late, the Reverend Dr. Billy Graham died some weeks ago now, and at the time there was such a flurry of mostly positive but some negative accounts of his life, and I didn't want to really go in with a rush. But I do want to just say something. I think he's a man worth reflecting upon, and I thought I'd have my say too. The first thing I want to say is that for me it was an amazing experience when I was a mid-year teenager. I think I would have been 16, and Billy Graham came to Melbourne for the Great Australian Crusade. The newspapers were incredibly cynical, and just before that there'd been another preacher come, and I'm not meaning to criticise him, but his name was Oral Roberts, and he was a Pentecostal faith healer. And when Oral came to Australia, I don't think he was boasting, but he really had this sense of feel about spiritual power and the power of God, and he was in touch with it. He felt all that. And so he kind of gave the impression that when he came to Australia, which in the late 50s was a very secular country. In fact, in many ways, although we had some real Christian roots in this country, and I think our values came out of what we call the Judeo-Christian worldview, we've still been basically a rather secular nation, rather than a church and spiritual nation. So when he came, this other Pentecostal preacher had sort of made big claims about what he was going to do in his big circus tent crusade. And the media and the public gave him hell, to use a term. And they, if I remember rightly, they threw stink bombs in the middle of his meetings. And I think they sought to burn his tent down. But anyway, whatever. He came under such unfair attacks in the Australian public that he fled home before he'd finished his crusade, as I understand it. And of course, when Billy Graham was coming, there was I remember I kept every clipping about Billy's visit, and I remember in one of those clippings it said, "We got rid of the last Yankee preacher that came here," talking about Oral Roberts, "and we'll get rid of this one too." So the attitude was that Billy Graham wouldn't make it here in pretty tough-thinking Aussie territory. Well, the first night he was at what then was called the West Melbourne Stadium, and I think it's called Festival Hall now, and it's about to be pulled down. But the West Melbourne Stadium was a reasonable sized place. I'm not sure if they could fit 10,000 or something in it. And I think the Graham organisation, from what I hear from people that seem to know, they were a bit nervous about what was going to happen. And they turned up on a wet evening for the first meeting. And although that would have been a small auditorium for Billy Graham, that stage in his career, it would have been a very, very big meeting for Australia. Well, when he came, they discovered that the place had been packed out long before his arrival at that boxing stadium, as it was, West Melbourne Stadium. And Billy went out and stood on the steps, a little sort of a walk out on the edge of the stadium. And he gave a very short, excellent little short Christian message from the steps to a crowd of, I think, some thousands who couldn't get into the building. And he made an appeal, I think, and people responded. And the next day the newspapers changed their tone, because I think everyone was amazed that he had packed out the stadium in his first meeting. Well, the rest is amazing history. By the time he got to his major crusade meeting for the youth that was held in what's called the Maya music bowl, which is a very big open air theatre, and people sit in some chairs and many of them on the lawn. And he got something like 75,000 to come to that first youth meeting. And that really stunned them. By the time he got to the end of his crusade, the numbers were so great that they really didn't know where to go in the city of Melbourne, and the only place where they could really take over 100,000 would have been what we call the Melbourne cricket ground. It's called the sacred turf in our country, and nobody was allowed to sit on the sacred turf in those days, and it was a very old world kind of arrangement where the officials, who were all males of course then, could sit in these special stands, and no women were ever allowed in the special members' stands, and neither were children. Well, long before the meeting was to start, although the Graham organisation had expressed behind closed doors some real nervousness, because if only 40 or 50,000 turned up at the MCG, it wouldn't look very impressive. Well, long before it was time to start, it was full. And the curator of the MCG then gave permission for the first time in history for women and children to fill those sacred special stands. And that wasn't enough. So then they allowed thousands to go out onto the sacred turf, as they called it, and I think I was one of something like 10,000 people that went out to sit on the holy turf where the great international cricket games are played in the Melbourne cricket ground. All I can say is that as a young man that was struggling with faith, was at high school, hearing all the critiques against religion, I was stunned. It certainly left an enduring mark on me that was to find its fulfilment really in my very early 20s, when I really had an encounter with faith that's never weakened since way back then, about 50 years ago, or over 50. So many people responded at the end of that meeting that they couldn't possibly bring people out the front, as they did often in Billy Graham crusades, to counsel them. They had thousands and thousands of people specially trained and well trained actually in how to sit down and talk to people about finding faith and then walking in their faith afterwards. And there was no hope. They weren't within a bull's roar of being able to counsel the number that responded, and when they asked them to stand. It must have been tens of thousands of people. And they were lasting decisions, many of those, because when I went to do theological studies in a college many, many years after, when I was well and truly an adult and married, a large proportion of the students at that Bible Training Institute had been converted in the Billy Graham crusade, where I sat on the lawn that day. Now, I just wanted to make a few quick comments, because while there's been a lot of hurrah for Billy regarding him being faithful to the gospel of Jesus and all of that, and that is true, there were some that were critical of him on a number of issues, and I just want to very quickly go through those issues. The first one is that some people said, you know, he spoke far too simply, he wasn't a scholar. I haven't time to go to any of these in depth, but I'm making strong statements for which, if you wanted to trace through and send some kind of note to me that you want further explanation, I do my best in my current state of physical ill health to give you answers. But the first one is this. I well remember when I was doing a PhD, at that very time when Billy was old and suffering from Parkinson's and had stopped travelling, it was said to him in an interview that I watched on American television when I was over there studying, when he was asked what he would change if he had his life over again, One of them was something I'd say too. In fact, most travelling preachers would, if they really loved their families and their marriage had held together. Because he said if he had his life over again, he'd have given more time to his wife and family. But the other interesting thing he said was, looking at the way the world is today, if he had his time over, although he did have a basic degree, and of course later on a conferred doctorate, but he said, I would have gone back to university to study cultural anthropology so I could really understand the ins and outs of different cultures around the world and address them in ways that were meaningful for them. Now, that's not a non-thinker when a man says that, and he sounded very, very intense about it too. The second thing is that over the years of his preaching, he often spent time with some of the most notable theologians in the world today. I know that for a fact, and in those years saw some of the interviews that were copied and recorded of his time with people like Niebuhr and others like that, who are outstanding scholars, particularly on the subject of theology and culture. Second thing I wanted to say was, I remember one night when I was in my late teens, listening to a radio program that he was on every week, and it was sent all over the world, and I was listening to it on HCJB, which was a very large international network that really came from Quito, Ecuador, and dealt a lot with foreign missions and that kind of thing. But on that particular program, called The Hour of Decision, Billy always spoke very differently to the way he spoke at crusades. He spoke faster and he packed a punch when he talked in those programs. And I remember in those programs, he didn't just give the more simple gospel messages he gave in his crusade meetings. In those meetings on radio, he addressed really difficult issues. And I just remember one quote that stuck with me at the time. He said, if God does not judge the United States of America for its greed and selfishness and abuse of power, he said, he'll have to come back and personally apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, that's not the kind of statement people would normally think Billy would make. But he made many statements like that on that radio program. The third thing I wanted to say was that some have criticised him about race, something about him not fully supporting some things that Martin Luther King did. Well, all I can say is the historic evidence is overwhelming that he was a friend of Martin Luther King. He didn't turn up, I think, at the great meeting that was held there at the Lincoln Memorial. I think that was the one. And people criticised him for not being there. Well, I don't know his reasons, but I know that Billy struggled on the issue of how one had to protest against injustice. It wasn't that he didn't believe in speaking against injustice. He often did in his preaching. But I think there were some differences as to strategy. How far could you go in civil disobedience? And great preachers right through history have struggled with that. And I mean, I'm a Methodist, so my background is John and Charles Wesley. And I think John and his brother Charles argued over this. And John, who was fairly much a supporter of the monarchy in his own day, he nevertheless called in his preaching for the people to commit civil disobedience because what was being done in slavery was so contrary to the teachings of the Scripture and was so cruel, so inhumane, and so unlike what gospel was taught by Jesus. So it's a battle. I think he didn't always agree with all of the tactics of Dr. King, but he certainly did support the struggle against segregation. In the South, in one of his early crusades as a young man, it's a matter of historic record that he defied his own committee, who looked after his finances, incidentally. He didn't have his hand on the purse strings, but he challenged his own committee about race because in a big crusade in the South, and I've lived in the South, so I know what it's like down there, even now that segregation is gone. The smell of it is thoroughly still there. But on this occasion, I understand Billy went down and he saw there were ropes marking off the sections where the black people would sit and where the white people would sit. And he just stood up against his own council and tore those ropes down and said he would not tolerate segregation in his meetings. There was never any sign that he showed anything else but respect for all cultures all over the world, as he probably travelled more extensively than any other preacher in history. And then let me say, historically, I became a bit of a hippie Christian at one stage, and I felt very strongly against the Vietnam War. And I believe I was right then, and I still hold that view. But in my stand against the Vietnam War, I wasn't destructive or hateful, and I certainly felt great sympathy for the soldiers that came back to my country that were forced by government to go over there and fight, so-called, for our country, and who suffered and came back with terrible wounds and mental breakdown, and many of them who died. I sat in tears at the special wall in Washington to honour those soldiers. So it wasn't just a, anti-soldier sort of thing. But I didn't believe the war was right. And a lot of others with me were troubled that Billy didn't take a stand on it. And I just want to say, I can't go into detail. I'm out of time for this one. But quite frankly, I was at a major international conference when Billy Graham, in his mature years, stood up before the thousands of delegates at this conference and apologised writ large. He apologised for the closeness of his relationship with Richard Nixon and explained that in his attempts to influence all of the presidents and to have some impact, not political, whether he was a Republican, I think he was Democrat actually, but whatever, he wasn't kowtowing to a political position, but he hung out with them hoping he could have an influence to bring them to faith and good values. So on that day, he humbly apologised to everybody for his close relationship with Richard Nixon. On the other hand, some have talked about the terrible division between Protestants and Catholics. Well, just to say, Billy very early in his crusades had Catholic bishops and archbishops and Orthodox priests on his stage, honouring them as part of the support base for his crusades. It impressed me so much that when I began as a young preacher, I think I was one of the first well-known preachers in this country who made a rule that I would not have an outreach program with any town or village unless the Catholics were invited to be a decision-making part of the so-called crusade committee. And I learnt that from Billy. He certainly was not sectarian in his attitudes. And then lastly, let me say, this was a man who sustained a marriage into the 90s, a man whose love and faithfulness to his wife was so clear that he would not even go in a car if a woman was going to be in the car apart from his wife without some other person there to make sure that he behaved well. And that's why, as far as I know, for all the sleazy attempts that were made, there doesn't appear to be any evidence of any successful slander about Billy Graham, as there has been, sadly, against many American faith healers and preachers over the years. But he was a man, whether he was as complex as we'd like him to be, because after all, if his more simple message didn't have enough content such that it would insult intelligence of the people, why did he have massive numbers of people coming to hear him? Why was it that in my city, probably the most celebrated minister who had all the academic qualifications, actually confessed openly in the public media that he had been converted to a personal relationship with Jesus Christ through Billy Graham preaching in our city. And he was the minister of one of the most celebrated churches in my city. I don't believe people would have responded to him if the message was too simplistic. Because after all, you're not wanting to lead someone into a PhD in theology when they probably haven't been to church for most of their life. You've got to start with the fundamentals, and that he stuck to faithfully. And I guess the final sentence to say is that this was a man untouched by financial chicanery, untouched by manipulation, untouched by grubby lip or grubby life. He had a purity of life and lip. And I believe whatever may have been his weaknesses, and I bet his critics under examination would show up with just as many, if not more, whatever they are, this dear saintly man who says that when he died he wasn't to be called dead, but simply a man who changed his address. And I believe in his message, and I believe that is what has happened. He's gone and changed his address, and he's living now on the eternal side of the river of life, reunited with his wonderful wife who was so faithful to him and to whom he was so beautifully loving and faithful too. I tell you what, our countries would be doing much better if they were populated with people of the moral values that man showed throughout his life, from a young man when he was first converted as a brush salesman. I guess that's all I got time to say. Could say a lot more. But Billy Graham is a man who gives us much to take notice of and emulate in our own lives when we look at the state of our societies all around the world at present. We desperately need whatever that gospel he preached really brings into the life of any man or woman when they accept it.